Whereas I have oodles and oodles of clothes. I have wet weather gear, I have hot weather gear, I have cold weather gear, I have extreme cold weather gear, and found in New Zealand you needed all of it every day.
Absolutely. The wind, I have never been so cold in my life. They don't have central heating or air, so during the winter you don't have double pane windows. I'd sleep with long johns and 20 blankets, and yes, I've never been that cold in my life. And they said it's hot, it was never hot. They don't know what hot is, period.
But you need that extra per diem because every weekend you're going to buy new clothes that'll make the next week work for you, and it never does.
Right. But you can write them off because they're necessary. Know your write-offs.
You should see my Arctic snow goose that's good down to minus 85 degrees in my moon boots that have 5-inch rubber pads on the bottom so
Did
you
you
don't
use it in
cold your
Iceland?
feet. I did. And I looked ridiculous.
I've got a pair of those same boots, yeah. 'Cause when you're, which is the other thing, especially if you're on a shoot, you're going to be outdoors at least 12 hours, if not 16 hours at a time. And I've been on shoots where people were not used to doing that type of stuff, and you're going to be outside, whether it's nighttime and raining or snowing or whatever it might be. So I just like to think of any shoot as a big camping trip with 200 other people.
But you learn two things from this, right? First is, when you're cold, it's not a matter of being warm, it's a matter of being less cold. And number two, you gotta be careful what your clothes are made of, because they always put heaters out, and I've seen a lot of crew burst into flames or melt their coats all around them. It's very dangerous.
I guess the other thing is to mention, because traveling the world sounds fantastic, but you've got to keep in mind that you're probably going to be working, and if you're in visual effects, you're probably putting a lot of hours, probably working a lot of days. You may be shooting, 6 days a week, or even working 7 days a week. So somebody told me once, don't confuse a vocation with a vacation. So, so while it's great being there, you've got to consider how much time you'll actually have and whether you might want to either spend a little bit more time before or after your project if you truly want to see the country. But it does allow you to see certain areas that you might not have seen. I wouldn't have gone to Slovakia if, I hadn't had to go for a project. So, it's an interesting experience, certainly.
You get amazing access, and then when the family comes to visit, they see things you never get to see. One of the things on my bucket list is the Great Barrier Reef, to swim on it. My whole family did that. I saw the beautiful inside of a stage for 7 weeks, day and night, but they had a great time. I've seen pictures.
My daughter had one of her best vacations when I was out of the country for 6 months, traveling with family and so forth, the Disney World, but. I guess the other thing to talk about is, what type of contract, especially if you're working, Jeff's already talked about a little bit if you're working directly for the studio, but if you're working for companies, what are the things that you should be looking out for in a contract? And in terms of paperwork, getting your passport and your visa and the work permits and all the other types of things that go with that.
The only, what I would have to say about that is that it depends a lot on the companies that you're going to ultimately go work for. Companies like Weta or MPC, so all the London facilities, Double Neg, D-Neg, Framestore, they're so accustomed to bringing in artists from around the world, and they're pretty good usually about having packets, or
They actually sent it. We worked for about 2.5 months to go through everything that was required for them to get my visa for me, and do a 10-month visa, and knowing that I was going to be there a year and a half, do a 10-month at first so that I didn't have to go through a physical and all these other things. So they were acutely aware of that type of thing.
So there's that, and then there is, I'm going to Shanghai, or I'm going to Beijing, or I'm going to Mumbai, or I'm going to Chennai. they may or may not have those kinds of services for you. So those are the ones that you have to be particularly mindful of. And once again, it's just doing your research, asking friends, colleagues for their advice on those things. And if you're like Jeff and you can ask and maybe get, that's great. But I think if you're, these days, if you're a visual effects artist, it's a very narrow spectrum that you're operating within, and you don't always, you very rarely dictate, those terms. But my only advice is just, if you're gonna go to all this trouble, work for the best companies. Don't bother with anyone else. Just work for the best companies, because they're the best because they take care of their people, they take care of their kit, and they get it. And those are the companies that you want to take your chances with.
And if you're not gonna work for the best, it behooves you to understand the business mentality of the region you're dealing with, because it isn't always what you think it is at all. Without going into details, there's been some very strange things in my life where you end up looking foolish because you're holding up a signed and countersigned document that's 14 pages long, and what it really meant is, well, we agreed in principle that you will work for us. And you go, well, we negotiated, you said I get this. And they go, we agreed in principle you'd work for us. And essentially the downside of any contract is it has to be reinforced. It was explained to me at one studio that they have attorneys on staff with nothing to do, and to keep you in court for 14 years would be their pleasure. And
Here on that one.
yeah, so you gotta be careful, and you gotta know the culture, the business culture that you're dealing with. Otherwise, stay with the big companies, because they generally don't do that kind of game on you.
Well, I did both a 14 employee company and a 30,000 employee in my both cases, and there's something that are very personal. First, if you have a criminal record, that's going to be a tough one, regardless of how much the company is willing to sponsor you. But there are also other aspects of your credential, your school, your background, and those kind of things that, as much as they know you might be the best artist in the world, but leaving your country might be very difficult. Regardless of how much sponsoring and help and legal people will help you out. So there are things that are, at the end of the day, is really between you and the immigration department, and they may say yes, they may say no, or you might have some little questions. So this is also part of the process.
Just a show of hands, is anyone aware of, other than Los Angeles-based companies overseas that are doing drug testing? Anyone? Yeah? Be mindful of that. I mean, they do it here.
Actually, you have to be very mindful if you're going in certain regions around the world for that, because the whole Southeast Asia is full of countries, starting from Singapore, through Malaysia, through Indonesia, where they have death penalty just for a joint. And they actually stop you at the airport, and they can randomly test you at the airport, even before passing through the through the passport. Yes. So they can just stop you there, test you, and if you are lucky that you're not on the other side of passport control, they will put you back on the plane directly and extradite you. If you're on the other side, they can just put you on a death row.
You're talking about drug consumption. I had somebody who was basically decided was doing this. He got everything set up, sold the house, everything was clean, go to the airport. I don't know what happened, but he'd been told, you don't cross the border. So he had everything done, everything ready. So that was, again, another example. It's something in his background that the immigration agent says, I don't trust you. Because that's the only time they see you. When you do the visa process, it's all through paperwork. If you have a lawyer who's going to help you, it's all fine. But there's only one moment that there's somebody in that receiving country that will see who you are. And in that case of that person that says, that was working for a very large technology company that says, I don't trust you, you don't cross the border, go back. He had sold the house and everything. And he decided to go to a different country where the law was different, and he get through that second country, but the first one he couldn't get through.
Ruth, can you talk a little more about, because this happens to me every year, Canada, the US has a reciprocal agreement for taxes, 180 days, 183, 186, depending on what it is. And then there's also, maybe you can shed a little more light with your experience, and if, for instance, I shot on a film in New Zealand for 5 months, hit my limit just before, decided I'm the guy that gets to go to China, so I don't have to hit that limit. And so I finished the shoot in China, but if I go back for reshoots within a certain amount of time, there's that to consider as well, because then I will be hitting my maximum 180, I think, 6 days in New Zealand. Maybe there's a little more to talk about with that. I know there's also different types of visas. For instance, if you're coming to the States, you have an H1 or A2. Some are show-based, some are company-based, right? And then I think the other thing to consider is if you're traveling to Canada and you're... Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
If you're traveling to Canada with out a visa and you have all your gear with you and they flag you, they'll stamp in your passport, they'll flag your passport for every other time, or every time thereafter you travel to Canada, you're going to be put in a slow line. You may be denied entry. I've seen it happen with people that are traveling with hard drives to the UK or Canada, you know, without visas. Then production's like, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. You'll be fine.
I traveled to Canada I went from LA to New Zealand for training, New Zealand to Vancouver for the mocap shoot, and then Vancouver back. And Weta took care of the Vancouver visa. I didn't have any problems. I was on a contract as a producer, a producer visa for Weta, so it was all taken care of. I mean, I didn't have any issues with the visas at all. But it was the 180-day rule didn't.
You were there longer.
I was there for 18 months, so it wasn't applicable. But I know what you're talking about, having worked at Disney and, you know, trying to make sure that our crews weren't there. They were there 156 days, so that we didn't have to indemnify their taxes, which no studio wants to do anyway.
Let me follow that up. So if you're in Canada also, and you had raised a very good point about having a CPA on both sides.
In both countries, yes. And paying taxes for 3 consecutive years, by the way.
That's
Because I
right.
was there for 16 and 17, but I have to pay taxes into 18. Have the GST, GST, yeah, there's a lot.
Right. The other thing to consider in Canada is if you're an independent contractor versus an employee. And if you're an independent contractor, they don't include, rules may have changed, so check them out yourself, but they don't include the non-working days. Where if you're an employee, they include the non-working days within your 180 days. So therefore, the date of entry to the date of exit, what you do not want to do, and this is for everybody who's planning on traveling, and if you come up to your 179th day and you're on the tarmac and the stroke of midnight hits, you are now in the country longer and you will owe taxes.
Right.
So there's that to consider as well.
So you can ask the company that you're going to work for if they indemnify your taxes on your behalf. Maybe they'll give you $5,000 aside, put it aside to pay those taxes. Just depends on what level you are going into that job. $5,000 won't cover it, it was an example.
And then Jeff, the other thing, and Scott, what I wanted to talk about with the traveler's insurance and things like that, if you're in the U.S., you can get a traveler's insurance for your health care. You can also get, as you were saying, anybody who's in a production supervisorial role that manages a crew on set is subject to lawsuits, even though the studio or whatever production, you are going to be named if you're in a lead position, and so you do want to have an umbrella clause.
It's called being prepared.
That's right.
It's expensive,
The other
but it's worth
thing-
it.
Yeah, it is worth it. and it's not really that much money.
Does
per
the
year.
studio pay for it, or you pay for it? Can you negotiate
I pay
it?
for mine. Mine's above
I
and
pay for
beyond.
mine too.
But that you negotiate them to do it, and then know that they're a studio, you cover the gap.
Yeah, that's right. That's what you're doing.
What's it called?
It's
It's just indemnity insurance for
Oh, okay.
loss, accidental loss, or accidental theft, loss, or death. And, they go into, if somebody loses a finger, it's this much, and, so they
Yeah.
price parts of your body.
and and it could be because you said you need the green screen over here. Whatever, they will find a reason, and, the wind blew it over, and the grips didn't have it set up, safely, the lawyers will say, and
So
someone
it's the
else will
visual
say, it
effects
was
guy's
Jeff
fault.
who said.
Always
put it
is.
there. The other thing to mention is the CDC website has, and so does our government state websites but CDC will tell you what they recommend, what shots to get, things like that. And my last thing is, when I went to China, we did a company move to China from New Zealand. We all applied for multi-entry visas, and it was at the whim of whatever was being stamped that day. I got a multi-entry 10-year visa. The guy next to me got a single-entry visa, and was there for 1 month, and if he left, he couldn't come back. So it's just kind of a potluck, and it depends on the different countries.
Don't work.
Afraid in a foreign country? Jeff, have you ever felt afraid, or anyone else afraid in a foreign country?
Yeah, once in Africa, when we had a line producer, who's a very smart guy, and he told us we were in South Africa near Port Edward, sort of out in the middle of nowhere, and there's this hotel there that looked like somebody had stolen a hotel from Las Vegas and dropped it in the jungle. It had casinos and Indian restaurants and a movie theater, and anyway, and so he told, he published it to everybody that on Saturday at noon, everybody's on the buses and we're going to Mozambique. And then Friday night at 9 o'clock, they did a door-to-door knock to tell you to get out now and get on the bus. And when we were going, what's going on? What happened was later that night, the hotel was hit by a gang of people with machine guns, and 9 of the hotel employees were shot, and they were looking for us because we had payroll, and they knew we'd have payroll to travel. So, there wasn't any precedent in my career before that, but after that, the crew really got with the idea of not telling anybody anything about what's going on, and you found places to hide your money. We weren't there, but it was really scary. And the same happened to her in New Zealand, in Wellington.
I just remember going to Mexico City for the first time and literally seeing jackbooted, armed guards at production companies. Everything is kidnappable.
Yep.
Dailies,
We
film
had
dailies.
dogs, we had
you know,
dogs stolen at Disney when we were doing Beverly Hills Chihuahua. We had dogs stolen in
Yeah.
Mexico because they thought they were that.
So that's very real. That's very real. The other thing about Mexico is more of a personal story, but you're driving through Mexico, or you're in a cab and you come to a stoplight, and there are all these children that come up to the car begging, and it's the most incredible thing. When you've grown up here in the United States, even in Canada, as I did, I had never seen anything like this. It was just the abject poverty, and then the wealth is all visible, in the neighborhood you're in. It's really remarkable. Yeah.
I felt afraid downtown LA in 2003. Just because I'm coming from a small town and getting into that 8 million people in that corner. Back then, I mean, today, I was there last week, it was a woman, with her stroller and walking the dog. It was super nice, but back then it was, for me, quite, an experience, but, it really, it's relative where you're coming from, I guess.
Hollywood Boulevard still scares the shit out of me.
Where we parked tonight scared me.
Yes,
Should I take
Walking,
the elevator?
walking,
Down, walking down
Can we go
Hollywood
to-
Boulevard.
can we go
is
together,
scary. Yeah, absolutely. Walk out
Guys,
together.
there are good things, there are good things about going somewhere and spending some
Absolutely.
time.
Yes.
Because, you know, it's about going, first of all, seeing a different world, different culture, but also being together, especially if you're in a bigger studio or in a bigger kind of a production, you see people from all around the world. You work with people who are in the same industry, but you never knew. And it's just, it's an interesting experience being an expat for a while, I have to say, you know. It gives a lot of pleasure at the end to know that, oh, I've been there, and, you know, I spent certain time there, and now I know how it works. There are good things about it, too.
Any other questions?
America is a
Tim?
foreign country.
Yes?
I was just thinking about America's a foreign country. I was just thinking about a show that I was associated with. Had a British visual effects supervisor who screwed up his visa, and it cost the studio $250,000 to get it straightened out for a 3-week shoot.
America's not a nice place if you're not from America.
Yeah, and also, you know, for going to socialized medicine places like, you know, like America, if you're on age 65 and above, that it pays to get supplemental insurance. Yeah.
Question.
I know we talked about the logistics of moving and maybe working. What about cross-border? I know of many map painters and a few people that are working from home. However, the studios are not liking that, as we all know. The content security is becoming a bigger and bigger thing.
That's right.
Any thoughts on how the future of technology might be helping to allow people to work from secure locations that aren't at a studio or a facility?
That's such a huge subject.
That's a whole panel.
Yeah, you can't cover that in 12 minutes.
My experience is that it's different on the production side than it is on the post-production side. I've met concept artists that do a lot of work remotely, work with directors, specific directors. They don't seem to suffer the same issues of security that post-production does. So if you're a post-production facility, the idea of hiring a map painter to do your work is probably, it's not gonna happen. Or let's just say it's a little bit more difficult. But on the production side, it seems to be a little bit looser. They don't have the same issues with the security. It's not like anything's in the can. It's just all concept work and drawings and whatnot.
It's not about security, it's mainly about breaking the tax incentive system.
I think it's both, Lubo. I think it's both. I think you're right. But I also think that there's a security issue.
It is I can tell you from a studio perspective,
It is
it's a security
When
issue.
it comes to big companies, it is security. You can't do this very easily for ILM or what, I agree. But at the same time, for years, I've been working remotely for productions which are happening somewhere else around the world, and gradually it just got narrower and narrower because first of all, it was about me physically being in Montreal or Vancouver and doing the work there. Then it was me physically paying taxes there in order to be part of the production. So it is mainly about tax incentive from my perspective. Of course, security is also another issue.
Yeah.
I can say for the technology company and most of the studios, I would say probably the smaller VFX houses, service company, they're pushing so hard to push everything on cloud. It's only a matter of time that those companies would say, well, I have an X number of people that could work remotely because the talent is there. I don't need to travel them. Everything we've been talking for an hour, the visa and all that stuff. There's going to be a critical mass of very talented people that may not need to work that much in the very near future. And I can guarantee you, talk to SMT, talk to most technology organization, there's so much push to push everything to the cloud at some point, and there's a security problem, but there's also it's a very big impact on performance. It's going to be a very nice debate for the next future.
I agree, yeah.
I have a small shop, and we have moved all our render. I have a small shop, and we've moved all our rendering to the cloud. You know, it's for various reasons.
Did you have to get approval?
No, we're working directly for studios, and they've never been asked. We're
Don't ask, don't tell?
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean,
They've never
because-
asked. I've been working with the same people at the studio since early
Did you go through their
2000s.
audit? Did you have to go through that?
No. Not any studio that I've ever worked for has asked for an audit.
No, I mean a security audit, where
I've
they have
never-
a whole laundry list of things
No,
that
I
they
know.
need you to have.
I've never been asked.
I did this 5 years ago in my company.
Yeah.
They came and they were going to shut my place down.
Yep.
So I had to go through everything, and they required from me all securities, including cards on the doors,
No
including,
internet access for your.
switching off internet
No DVD
from the
burn on any
machines,
machine,
creating a
yes.
special machine for internet. It was horrendous. It was like a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, I've never been asked.
And very, very expensive.
The concept is regardless if you have your gear locally or you have your gear remotely, the MPA audit will happen no matter what. I mean, we can today do our bank transaction on our phone. It's only a matter of time that somebody would say, well, the cost-effective process is much easier, simpler to go on the cloud.
But you know, a VPN access to something, a reputable cloud like Amazon. I mean, the CIA is using it.
Yeah, I should
And
mention.
then on the counterpart, you know what happened with the credit card company, Equifax, right?
Yeah, but they.
So there's
they
always a
weren't-
counterpart on that.
Right, but they weren't. They were keeping their stuff on an available server, unencrypted, blah blah blah.
Regardless of the reason, you're totally right. Regardless of the reason, the consumer, which is a studio, would say, well, there's a drawback of security and the impact of performance.
Yeah, well, AWS does have quite a bit of security built in and multiple levels as well as they.
Yeah,
you
everything's
can also
encrypted on it.
encrypt it as well.
Okay.
I understand, but the
Somebody
studios require the audit, so I'm extremely surprised
Well,
to hear.
and AWS is supposedly MPA certified, so.
Other questions or
I just have a comment.
story or? Okay.
This is on a completely different subject, but one that is, I think, important when you cross borders. And usually when I go on a show, I'm the only US person, or there may be 2 other people. And what I find is that part of it, this is sort of the social acclimation to the environment and what you do. Often I find that you're with the crew all the time, and you really want to have, meet people in the country, have a social life, have something entirely, the crew doesn't want to see you, you don't want to see them, you want to meet other people. So one thing that I do is when I go to any country, I spend a couple of days trying to find the best restaurant that I would go to over and over again. And I go to that restaurant every day for like 3 months. And after about a month, they start recognizing you. And then you start talking to them and you start meeting people, and it goes from there. And I find every time it's just expanded into all these relationships that have nothing to do with film. And because you're on a film, you're like this rock star, so, and it's interesting. And I find that that's the way I've gotten through these experiences for months and months,
Great idea,
is to be able to do that.
Very good. Good
great
thought.
idea.
Other questions or we'll get about 5 minutes or so?
When I worked in Canada, they were required to purchase private insurance for me. Is that true in most of the other countries you guys have worked in?
I don't know the answer to that
Well, in
question.
Singapore, it's forbidden to be there without insurance. In Singapore, it's forbidden for somebody to be there without insurance.
I think in Australia, you are required to carry insurance in Australia, and that's one thing that you have to be very aware of
Who buys it?
Well, you know,
Weta carried insurance for me when I was, this is so weird. Weta carried insurance for me when I was in Vancouver, but when I was in New Zealand, because I was living there, I just had to pay more money for socialized medicine, you know. I had to pay like $150 every time I went to the doctor, where my colleagues didn't have to pay anything.
But the key to this, though, is you just got to do the research and find out what the country requires, because half the countries, depending how much time you spend in the country, you're covered under their socialized medicine or a large co-pay fee sometimes, but sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's not.
Hi. So as someone who is looking to go into this industry when I graduate, what are some of the best companies do you think that would be a good place to start out at for someone who wants to be a visual effects supervisor and doesn't want to get stuck being like a rotoscope artist for 10 years?
Look, I someone who grew up in the business from 16 years old, I think the lesson that I learned was that, and then eventually becoming a manager and being in a position to hire people. My philosophy has always been always work for the best companies, okay? So if you get your first job, you have to really look at the company that you're working for and determine, hey, you know, just how good are these guys? And if you determine that, and I always tell young artists, don't get complacent, don't get lazy. This is not where you should be stopping. Don't get too comfortable no matter where you are, because what you want to do is you want to keep advancing. And what you want to do, and basically large companies cherry pick from small companies. They use the small companies to do their training for them. The smaller companies pay you shit money because they get your enthusiasm and your talent and whatnot, and they give you the opportunity. That's a fair deal. But then at some point, you need to say, okay, now it's time for the next thing. And that's just simple research, is identifying who those companies are, and more importantly, who do I want to work for?
But how do you get from artist to supervisor?
Experience. You're just going to have to work up the ladder. I know some people get out of school and they just want to jump right to the front there. But,
Direct.
But the main thing is to try to get as much experience in different departments as you can. And that's part of the issue. If you work for a small company, you may actually be doing more stuff.
That's right.
And get more hands-on stuff than if you work at a big company and you have to specialize. But if there's everybody filling all those top roles, then it's difficult to move into that. So sometimes you have to switch companies because they go, well, we're full up and we're not interested. Because sometimes you do a great job at something, go, well, we're hiring this other guy because you're doing a great job doing this. We don't want to lose you doing that. So we'll bring in somebody else. So you just have to kind of reevaluate the system, you know, in your situation like every year and see how you're doing and what's happening.
Because one of the consequences, I'm so sorry. One of the consequences, if you stay too long, you're brought in at a very low rate, obviously, and every year you're negotiating the best you can for increase in salary. But at some point, you really start to fall behind in what the market rate is, and so oftentimes you have to leave in order to make more money. And in LA, it's famously called the Brian Grill effect. And Brian was a guy that worked at Digital Domain forever, and he got very frustrated that he wasn't making what he knew he could be making. And so he left to go, I think it was to BOP, to work on Independence Day and whatnot. And then finally he got the money that he deserved, and then he eventually comes back to DD. And so they called it the Brian Grill effect. That's what you have to do.
In Canada, we call it the Celine Dion effect. Yeah, she had to leave the country to be recognized. I worked in my 30-year careers, 20 companies, from 14 to 150,000. And the bigger one was not the funniest one. Right in the middle, I worked for a company that was really high profile, 100 people. And after 6 months I left, I didn't fit in. It's also a cultural, you know.
Yeah.
Do I fit with this group of people? Do they have the same value as I have? And at that point, this one, I was really disappointed. I was working on a very high profile feature film. And I said, you know what? As much as the film are very, you know, high profile, I didn't fit. I said, I'm sorry, I cannot stay here. And it was a good decision in retrospect.
One of my professors recommended the third floor as a place to start out at because they specialize. Could you respect to that?
I don't know why I turned it off. I would start at Proof.
Proof.
Yeah, Proof Inc. It's been around 15 years.
And she just
Previs,
got hired as executive
Postviz.
producer.
You know,
I'll tell you
actually,
afterwards,
somebody
we have
worked there?
different things to tell
actually,
you.
what I would say to you is really look at the culture of the companies because, for instance, Proof is embedded with the filmmakers where third floor you work at the third floor facility. So I think you need to do some research. Halon, third floor, Proof. There's a lot of us out there. But
And what none of you asked him is, why do you want to be an effects supervisor? What do you think that job is? Because I guarantee you that you don't really know what that job is. We know what that job is. Unless you like set politics and negotiations, the art part, that's the fun part, but mostly it's all this other shit you have to swim through. And it doesn't matter how big a film it is, or small it is, or high profile, or how much money you don't have, the experience scales. And it's always difficult. And then we get to make cool images, sometimes, in spite of.
Kept me an art director all that time. I never wanted to become here. Yeah.
There are other jobs more fun and creative.
I was going to say to the young students that one way to do it, first of all, you want to be a generalist, like you said, if you want to be a supervisor. You can't get stuck in one department too long. And the other thing is I think I advise people to work in a small shop when they first get out of school, make a lot of mistakes, work on everything, you know, learn everything top to bottom, and then go work in a big shop and measure yourself against a large group and see how will you get to department head quickly and that kind of thing, and see what your capabilities are, and then you can kind of do whatever you want. But one thing I'd suggest is don't start your own company, because then you get stuck there and you don't ever meet anyone. And you're responsible for everyone else's payroll.
Thank you, Jim. So anyway, we're out of time. And thank you everyone for coming out, and thanks to our great panel here. And once again, thank you, Tony, for putting all this together for us.